The smack echoed like a gunshot through courtroom 302. Officer Bradley Collins thought he was just putting a terrified, defenseless black teenager in her place. He didn't know the courtroom doors were about to swing open. He didn't know he had just assaulted the daughter of Langley's most ruthless operative. The air inside the Cook County Courthouse was thick with the smell of cheap floor wax and stale despair. For 19-year-old Maya Jenkins, sitting at the scarred wooden defense table, the room felt less like a hall of justice and more like a slaughterhouse. She was a second-year nursing student at Loyola University, a girl whose criminal record consisted of a single overdue library book in middle school. Yet, today, she was wearing a faded orange jumpsuit, her wrists shackled to a waist chain, facing 3 counts of felony assault on a police officer. Beside her sat David Horowitz, an overworked, underpaid public defender who was currently sweating through his off-the-rack suit. He hadn't looked her in the eye once since the hearing began. On the witness stand sat the architect of Maya's nightmare, Officer Bradley Collins. Collins was a 12-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, a man whose thick neck spilled over the tight collar of his dress uniform. He had the kind of smug, immovable confidence that only came from years of absolute immunity. His disciplinary file was notoriously thick. Rumors of excessive force, illegal searches, and coerced confessions followed him like a shadow, but the union always made sure the complaints vanished. Officer Collins, the assistant district attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Sarah Lynn, asked, "Can you describe the events of the evening of October 14th? Collins leaned into the microphone, his voice a gravelly drawl. "I initiated a routine traffic stop on South Michigan Avenue. The defendant's vehicle had a busted tail light. When I approached the driver's side, the defendant was highly agitated, belligerent. I asked for her license and registration, and she refused. When I asked her to step out of the vehicle for my own safety, she lunged at me, striking me in the face and chest. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the man, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. It was a lie, all of it. The tail light hadn't been broken. She hadn't lunged. She had been terrified when Collins approached her car with his hand resting on his holster, barking commands before she could even roll down the window. When she had fumbled for her purse to get her ID, he had ripped her out of the car by her hair, slamming her face first into the cold asphalt. The bruises on her ribs were still throbbing. "Objection," Horowitz muttered, half rising from his chair. "Hearsay." Or, leading the witness, Judge Richard Sterling, a weary man who looked like he had checked out of his profession a decade ago, barely looked up from his paperwork. "Overruled, Mr. Horowitz." "Sit down," Collins smirked, a tiny, self-satisfied curling of his upper lip that only Maya could see from her angle. He knew he had won. He always won. The system was a machine designed to grind girls like Maya into dust, and Collins was happily pulling the lever. "She was out of control, Your Honor," Collins continued, addressing the judge directly with practiced sincerity. "I had to use necessary force to subdue her. It's a shame, really, but in this line of work, you never know when a routine stop is going to turn deadly." Maya's hands trembled against the heavy chains. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She thought of her mother, Valerie, who had been out of the country on a business trip for a logistics firm when Maya was arrested. Maya hadn't even been able to reach her. She was entirely alone. "That is a lie." Maya's voice cracked like a whip across the quiet courtroom. She hadn't planned to speak, but the words tore out of her throat. She stood up, the chains rattling loudly. "He dragged me out of my car. He planted his knee in my back." "I never touched him." Judge Sterling banged his gavel, his face flushing red. "Defendant will sit down and remain silent, or I will hold you in contempt of court." "Control your client, Horowitz," the ADA snapped. But Collins didn't wait for the judge or the lawyer. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a flash of predatory rage. In his world, compliance was absolute, and defiance was violently punished. He stepped down from the witness box, crossing the short distance to the defense table in 3 long strides. "I said sit down," Collins growled, his voice dropping an octave. "Don't you come near me," Maya cried, shrinking back, but the chains anchored her to the table. Horowitz stood up, weakly holding out a hand. "Officer, please, I've got this." Collins shoved the public defender aside like a rag doll. Horowitz stumbled and crashed into the gallery railing. Before the bailiff could even react, Collins reached across the table, grabbing Maya by the collar of her jumpsuit. "You don't talk in here, you little." With a sickening crack, Collins brought his open palm across Maya's face. The force of the blow snapped her head to the side. The room gasped in collective shock. Maya collapsed back into her wooden chair, her ears ringing violently. The metallic taste of blood flooded her mouth from where her teeth had cut into the inside of her cheek. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over courtroom 302. For a split second, Collins looked around, realizing he had just struck a shackled defendant in open court. But the arrogance quickly returned to his eyes. He puffed out his chest, looking toward the judge. "Defendant was attempting to assault me again, Your Honor. I was securing the area." Judge Sterling looked utterly paralyzed, his gavel hovering uselessly in the air. The bailiff, a young guy in his 20s, took a hesitant step forward, unsure of whether to arrest the cop or help the girl. Maya touched her cheek, her fingers coming away stained with blood. The tears finally spilled over, not from pain, but from the absolute, crushing helplessness. She closed her eyes, waiting for the floor to swallow her. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The hinges groaned loudly, shattering the tense silence of the room. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the back. Standing in the doorway was Valerie Jenkins. She did not look like the frantic, hysterical mother of an accused criminal. She looked like a corporate executioner. Valerie wore a sharply tailored, midnight blue Armani suit, her heels clicking against the linoleum with the steady, measured rhythm of a metronome. Her face was an unreadable mask of cold, flawless stone. Behind her walked 2 towering men in impeccably fitted charcoal suits. They didn't look like police. They looked like the men who made police officers disappear. "Excuse me, ma'am, court is in session," the bailiff stammered, recovering his senses and moving to block the aisle. "You can't come in here." Valerie didn't even break her stride. She didn't look at the bailiff. She simply kept walking. The man in the charcoal suit to her left stepped forward, smoothly intercepting the bailiff. Without a word, the man reached into his jacket and flashed a matte black leather credential case. Whatever the bailiff saw in that case drained the blood entirely from his face. He stepped backward so fast he nearly tripped over his own boots, flattening himself against the wooden pews. "Ma'am!" Judge Sterling barked, finding his voice. "Identify yourself immediately, or I will have you arrested." Valerie reached the wooden gate separating the gallery from the court. She pushed it open. Her eyes bypassed the judge, the prosecutor, and the public defender, landing squarely on Maya. Seeing the bright red handprint blossoming across her daughter's cheek and the thin line of blood dripping from her lip, Valerie stopped. For a fraction of a second, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air grew heavy, thick with a sudden, localized atmospheric pressure. "Mom?" Maya whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm here, baby," Valerie said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It wasn't loud, but it carried effortlessly, cutting through the ambient noise of the room like a scalpel. She walked past Horowitz, who was still picking himself up off the floor, and stopped inches away from Officer Bradley Collins. Collins towered over her by at least 8 inches, a wall of muscle and Kevlar. But as Valerie looked up at him, Collins instinctively took a half-step back. There was something completely devoid of fear in the woman's eyes. It was the look of someone evaluating a target for demolition. "Who the hell are you?" Collins sneered, though his voice lacked its previous bravado. Valerie ignored him. She turned her attention to the bench. "Your Honor, my name is Valerie Jenkins. I am this young woman's mother. I am also respectfully requesting that you immediately dismiss all charges against my daughter with prejudice and remand this man." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Collins without looking at him. "Into federal custody." Judge Sterling let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Excuse me? Ma'am, you are dangerously close to a contempt charge. This is a state court, and you do not dictate." "Richard Sterling," Valerie interrupted, her voice perfectly level. "Appointed to the circuit court in 2014. Before that, you were a partner at Sterling, Hughes, and Vance. You have a summer home in Lake Geneva, a mild heart condition, and a nephew whose DUI was quietly expunged by the very precinct Officer Collins works for. Am I missing anything, Richard?" The judge's mouth snapped shut. He gripped his gavel so hard his knuckles turned white. "How do you?" "I know a great deal," Valerie said smoothly. She turned her gaze back to the cop. "For instance, I know all about Officer Bradley Thomas Collins. Badge number 4489. Collins puffed out his chest, stepping into her personal space to use his size to intimidate her. "Listen to me, lady. I don't care who you think you are. Your kid attacked a police officer. She's going to Statesville. And if you don't back off, you'll be in the cell next to her." Valerie didn't blink. "You live at 419 Elm Street in Oak Park. You're 3 months behind on your mortgage because of a crippling sports betting addiction you feed through a bookie operating out of a barber shop in Joliet. An addiction that led you to shake down a confidential informant named Marcus Trey Rollins 2 weeks ago for $6,000. Collins froze. The color rapidly drained from his flushed, aggressive face. You're full of—" "Shut your mouth," Valerie commanded. It wasn't a yell. It was an order delivered with such absolute, bone-crushing authority that Collins literally clicked his teeth together. Valerie reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. She tossed it onto the defense table. It landed with a heavy, final thud. That folder contains wiretap transcripts, financial records, and sworn affidavits from 3 of your fellow officers who are currently cooperating with a federal task force, Valerie said, her voice echoing in the dead-silent courtroom. It also contains the unedited dashcam footage from your cruiser on the night of October 14th. The footage that you reported corrupted to your captain. The footage that clearly shows you dragging my daughter from her car without provocation. The ADA, Sarah Lynn, stood up, looking panicked. "Your Honor, the state had no knowledge of any of this." "The state," Valerie said, finally looking at the prosecutor, "is incompetent, which is why the adults are here to clean up the mess. Who are you?" Collins breathed out, his hands actually shaking now. He looked at the 2 silent men in charcoal suits standing by the gate, realizing with a sudden, horrifying clarity that they were not private security. They were government, high-level government. Valerie finally smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm the mother of the girl you just made the monumental mistake of touching," Valerie said softly. "But in Langley, Virginia, they call me the deputy director of the clandestine service. And Officer Collins, you just assaulted my only child." The silence that followed was absolute. The predator had just realized he was trapped in a cage with a monster, and the door had just locked behind him. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Officer Bradley Collins stood frozen, his eyes darting between Valerie Jenkins and the 2 men in charcoal suits standing at the gallery gate. The arrogance that had defined his career was evaporating, replaced by the primal, suffocating terror of a man who suddenly realized he was no longer at the top of the food chain. "CIA?" Judge Richard Sterling finally choked out, his voice a pale, reedy rasp. "The Central Intelligence Agency does not have domestic law enforcement jurisdiction, Miss Jenkins. You cannot just waltz into a Cook County courtroom." "You are absolutely correct, Judge," Valerie interrupted smoothly, her tone conversational but laced with venom. She didn't even look at him. Her eyes were locked onto Collins. "The agency operates internationally. I protect this country from foreign threats. But when I found out a domestic threat was brutalizing my daughter, I made a few phone calls to some friends who do have jurisdiction." Valerie snapped her fingers, a sharp, singular crack. The man in the charcoal suit on the left, the one who had terrified the bailiff, stepped through the wooden gate. He reached into his coat and produced a federal warrant, slapping it onto the defense table right next to the folder Valerie had dropped. "Special Agent Gregory Sullivan," the man announced, his voice booming with practiced, unquestionable authority. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption Unit. Officer Bradley Collins, you are under arrest for deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated battery, witness tampering, and federal racketeering." Collins stumbled backward, bumping into the witness stand. "This is a joke. This is a setup. You can't do this. I want my union rep. Call Patrick Gallagher. Call Captain Boyd." Valerie tilted her head, a terrifying smile playing on her lips. "I had breakfast with Captain Kenneth Boyd at 6 o'clock this morning at a diner in Skokie. I showed him the same dash cam footage I just brought here. I also showed him the offshore bank accounts where he's been hiding the kickbacks he takes from your little extortion ring." Kenneth wept into his eggs. "Bradley, he signed a proffer agreement with the U.S. Attorney's Office by 8:30. He gave you up to save his own pension." "No," Collins whispered, his face turning the color of wet ash. "Boyd wouldn't." "He did," Agent Sullivan said, pulling a pair of heavy stainless steel handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." "I'm a Chicago police officer!" Collins roared, a sudden, desperate burst of adrenaline fueling a final stand. He reached down, his hand hovering dangerously close to his duty weapon. "You feds think you can just march in here." Before Collins could even brush the leather of his holster, the second man in the charcoal suit moved. It was a blur of calculated, devastating violence. The agent crossed the space in a fraction of a second, sweeping Collins's legs out from under him. The massive cop crashed to the floor with a sickening thud, the wind knocked out of his lungs in a sharp gasp. In one fluid motion, the agent pinned Collins's arms, stripped the Glock from his holster, and tossed it to the bailiff, who caught it with trembling hands. Agent Sullivan stepped over, hauling Collins up by his collar and ratcheting the handcuffs onto his wrists. The clicks echoed off the wood paneling. Click, 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 the sound of a life ending. Ada Sarah Lynn was practically hyperventilating, furiously shoving her files into her briefcase. She looked at Judge Sterling, who was sinking lower into his high-backed leather chair, looking physically ill. "Your Honor," ADA Lynn stammered. The state withdraws all charges against Maya Jenkins. We motion for immediate dismissal." "Granted," Judge Sterling squeaked, banging his gavel weakly. Case dismissed. "Bailiff, unshackle the defendant." The young bailiff practically sprinted to the defense table, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. The heavy chains fell away from Maya's wrists and waist, clattering onto the floor. The moment she was free, Maya's knees buckled. The adrenaline that had kept her upright was gone, leaving only exhaustion and the throbbing pain in her cheek. Before she could hit the floor, Valerie was there. The cold, terrifying executioner vanished. In her place was just a mother. Valerie wrapped her arms around her daughter, pulling her tightly against her chest. She buried her face in Maya's hair, her shoulders trembling slightly. "I've got you," Valerie whispered fiercely, kissing the top of Maya's head. "I'm right here. Nobody is ever going to touch you again." Maya sobbed into her mother's Armani shoulder, burying her face in the familiar scent of vanilla and expensive wool. For the first time in 72 hours, she felt safe. Across the room, Agent Sullivan was dragging a handcuffed, humiliated Bradley Collins toward the heavy oak doors. Collins looked back, his eyes meeting Valerie's over Maya's shoulder. Valerie stopped hugging her daughter just long enough to hold the dirty cop's gaze. Her eyes were dead, devoid of any mercy or pity. She gave him a slow, chilling nod. "This is just the beginning," that look said. 4 hours later, Bradley Collins sat shivering in a windowless interrogation room at the Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago. His shoelaces, belt, and tie had been confiscated. He was wearing the same uniform he had swaggered into court with, but now it looked absurd on him, stripped of its badge and brass. He stared at the stainless steel table, his mind spinning in chaotic, terrifying circles. He was a veteran cop. He knew how the system worked. He knew that cops went to a special kind of hell when they were locked up. The realization that he was going to federal prison and that his own captain had sold him out felt like a physical weight crushing his chest. The heavy steel door clicked open. Collins didn't look up, expecting Agent Sullivan or a federal prosecutor. Instead, a cup of lukewarm black coffee slid across the metal table, stopping inches from his cuffed hands. Collins looked up. Valerie Jenkins was sitting across from him. She had shed the suit jacket, her white silk blouse pristine, her posture perfectly relaxed. She looked like she was sitting in a boardroom, not a federal holding cell. "How did you get in here?" Collins croaked, his throat raw. "My lawyer, your union lawyer, Peter Mitchell, abandoned you 3 hours ago when the feds froze his firm's assets pending an investigation into money laundering," Valerie said, taking a slow sip from her own paper cup. "You don't have a lawyer, Bradley. You don't have a union. You don't have a captain. You don't even have a pension. As of 20 minutes ago, the city revoked it under the felony forfeiture statute." Collins slumped, burying his face in his hands. "Why? Why did you have to destroy my whole life? She was just a kid in a car." "That is exactly the point," Valerie said, her voice dropping to a glacial whisper. "She was just a kid, and you thought you could break her because you believed nobody was watching." Valerie leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. "You know, Bradley, when I got the phone call that my daughter had been arrested for assaulting a police officer, I was confused. Maya is a nursing student. She rescues stray dogs. She doesn't even kill spiders in her apartment. So, I used some specialized software to look into the routine traffic stop." Collins looked up, dread pooling in his stomach. "I wanted to know why you pulled her over," Valerie continued. "You said busted taillight, but the street cameras on South Michigan Avenue showed her car was in perfect condition. So I dug deeper. I looked at the terminal in your cruiser. I looked at the keystrokes you made right before you hit your sirens." Valerie pulled a single sheet of paper from her pocket and slid it across the table. It was a printed log of a police database search. "You didn't pull her over by accident," Valerie said. "You ran her plates, and when the system showed that the registered owner of the vehicle, Maya Jenkins, had no criminal record, no outstanding warrants, and no immediate family listed at her local address, you saw a target. You saw a young, black college student who looked isolated. You pulled her over to meet your monthly quota for arrests, and when she didn't cower the way you wanted her to, you dragged her out by her hair." Collins stared at the paper. He couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. She knew everything. "But that's just the petty, pathetic part of your file," Valerie said, leaning back. "The real tragedy for you, Bradley, is the sports betting. See, the FBI has been building a case against Dominic Russo for 2 years. At the mention of the name, Collins violently flinched. Dominic Russo was the ruthless bookie operating out of Joliet. Collins owed him over $60,000. The FBI couldn't get a wiretap on Russo's inner circle, Valerie said softly. But they didn't need one, because you were stupid enough to call his burner phones from your personal cell phone. The feds were listening to you beg Russo for more time. They were listening when you promised to provide Russo with police patrol routes to protect his illegal shipments in exchange for clearing your debt. "Oh, God," Collins whimpered, the absolute gravity of his situation finally breaking him. Tears spilled over his cheeks. "Please, you have to put me in protective custody. If I go to general population, Russo has guys inside. They'll kill me." Valerie stared at the crying man. There was no triumph in her face, only a cold, clinical satisfaction. "You hit my daughter," Valerie said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "You put your hands on her, you locked her in a cage, and you stood in a court of law and tried to take away her future." She stood up, smoothing the front of her blouse. "I'm not going to kill you, Bradley. I don't have to," Valerie said, turning toward the door. "I just made sure the unsealed indictment paperwork, the paperwork that details exactly how you gave up Russo's patrol routes to the FBI accidentally got leaked to the Joliet Corrections Facility where you'll be awaiting trial." Collins bolted out of his chair, the cuffs rattling violently as he slammed his hands on the table. "No, you can't do that. That's a death sentence. You're a monster." Valerie paused with her hand on the doorknob. She looked back over her shoulder, her eyes utterly dead. "No," she replied softly. "I'm a mother. Enjoy your stay, officer." She opened the door and walked out, the heavy steel slamming shut behind her, sealing Bradley Collins inside his tomb. The fallout from courtroom 302 did not simply make the local evening news. It triggered a seismic shockwave that ripped through the foundation of the Chicago political and judicial machine. Valerie Jenkins did not just want Bradley Collins's badge. She wanted to salt the earth where his career had grown. Within 48 hours of Collins's arrest, the Department of Justice announced a sweeping federal probe into the Cook County court system. Theodore Harrison, an ambitious, no-nonsense federal prosecutor from the Northern District, was personally handpicked to lead the task force. With a mountain of perfectly organized, undeniable evidence, anonymously couriered to his desk by a concerned citizen, evidence that had completely bypassed the compromised local servers, Harrison went to work with a machete. Judge Richard Sterling never made it back to his bench. On a rainy Tuesday morning, 2 plainclothes FBI agents quietly escorted him out of his Lake Geneva summer home. The official charge was judicial misconduct and tax evasion, tied to a web of offshore shell companies handled by his former law partners. Facing a decade in federal prison and the total loss of his estate, Sterling resigned in disgrace and pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of mail fraud. The stroke he suffered 3 weeks later, brought on by the immense stress of his ruined reputation, left him permanently confined to a wheelchair in an assisted living facility in Skokie. The public defender, David Horowitz, voluntarily surrendered his law license after the Illinois State Bar Association opened an inquiry into his pattern of aggressively coercing innocent, low-income defendants into taking plea deals to save himself trial prep. Even the police union couldn't stop the bleeding. Union President Patrick Gallagher held a furious press conference, attempting to spin the narrative into an unprecedented federal overreach and defending Collins as a decorated hero. By the next morning, Gallagher's own emails, detailing a systematic slush fund used to intimidate internal affairs investigators, were leaked to the Chicago Tribune. Gallagher stepped down before noon, but the hardest, most devastating karma was reserved for Bradley Collins. His trial was brief, brutal, and entirely one-sided. The prosecution's star witness was Officer Diane Gable, a rookie cop from Collins's own precinct who had quietly despised his brutal tactics for months. Under federal protection, Gable testified that Collins regularly bragged about targeting college-aged minorities because they didn't have the money to fight back. When the jury foreman read the verdict guilty on all 9 federal counts, including civil rights violations and racketeering, Collins did not look like the towering predator who had slapped a shackled girl. He looked small, pathetic, and hollowed out. Judge Eleanor Fitzgerald, a woman known for her absolute lack of sympathy for dirty cops, delivered the sentence. "Mr. Collins, you were given a badge and a gun to protect the vulnerable," Judge Fitzgerald said, her voice echoing through the packed federal courtroom. "Instead, you used them to terrorize a community and brutalize a defenseless young woman in a court of law. You are a disgrace to the uniform and a danger to society. I sentence you to 180 months in federal prison. There will be no possibility of early parole. 15 years. 2 weeks later, the heavily armored transport bus rolled through the towering, razor-wire-topped gates of the United States Penitentiary, Terre Haute. Because the leaked indictment paperwork had branded him an informant against Dominic Russo's gambling syndicate, the standard protective custody protocols for former law enforcement were accidentally delayed in the bureaucratic pipeline. Warden Samuel Whitman, a man who allegedly owed his own career advancements to a senator friendly with the intelligence community, simply looked the other way. For his first week in general population, Collins lived in a state of sheer, vibrating terror. The swaggering, thick-necked cop who used to command the streets of the South Side was gone. He jumped at the sound of heavy boots on the concrete. He barely slept, his eyes darting to the shadows of his cell. He was entirely stripped of the immunity that had shielded him his entire adult life. He was prey. The reality of his new existence hit him on a Tuesday afternoon in the prison laundry room. Collins was sorting heavy canvas uniform bags when the heavy steel door clicked shut. The hum of the industrial washing machines was deafening, drowning out the sudden, heavy silence that fell over the room. 4 men stepped out from behind the rows of steaming dryers. One of them was Arthur Pendleton, a terrifyingly massive man with a jagged scar running from his ear to his collarbone. Pendleton had been a mid-level enforcer for Dominic Russo's crew before Collins had started squeezing the syndicate for his own gambling debts. Collins backed away, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Listen, Arthur. Let's just talk. I didn't give Russo up. The feds made it look like that. I swear to God." Pendleton didn't say a word. He just walked forward with the slow, inevitable momentum of a glacier. Collins raised his hands, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. "Please. Guards. Hey!" The guard stationed outside the heavy wire mesh window slowly turned his back, deeply engrossed in his clipboard. "You got a big mouth, Collins," Pendleton growled, his voice a low rumble over the churning washing machines. "And heavy hands when you're dealing with kids in handcuffs. But you ain't wearing a badge today." When Pendleton's open hand collided with Collins's face, it wasn't just a slap. It was a concussive blow, backed by 250 pounds of muscle and years of hardened prison survival. The sound mirrored the terrible crack that had echoed in courtroom 302 months prior, but magnified by a factor of 10. Collins was thrown completely off his feet, crashing violently into a metal laundry cart. Blood instantly poured from his shattered nose and split lip. He scrambled backward across the damp concrete floor, utterly defenseless, exactly as Maya had been. He curled into a tight, trembling ball, sobbing openly as the men surrounded him. They didn't kill him. They didn't even put him in the infirmary. They just left him there, bleeding and broken among the dirty laundry, with a clear message. This is your life now. Every single day, for the next 15 years. Hundreds of miles away from the damp concrete of Terre Haute, the afternoon sun was streaming through the bay windows of a beautiful brownstone in Georgetown. Maya Jenkins sat on a plush velvet sofa, a thick medical textbook resting open on her lap. Her physical bruises had healed months ago, leaving behind flawless, warm brown skin. The psychological scars were still there, lingering in the quiet moments when a siren wailed in the distance. But they were fading. She was back at university, transferring her nursing credits to Georgetown to be closer to her mother. The front door unlocked, and Valerie walked in. The deputy director of the clandestine service was wearing a soft cashmere sweater, a stark contrast to the midnight blue armor she had worn in Chicago. She dropped her keys in the ceramic bowl by the door and smiled, a genuine, warm expression that completely transformed her face. "Hey, sweetheart," Valerie said, walking over and kissing the top of Maya's head. "How was clinicals today?" "Tiring," Maya admitted, leaning into her mother's touch. "I did my first successful IV insertion on a real patient, though. Only missed the vein once." "That's my girl," Valerie said softly, sitting down next to her. She looked at her daughter, vibrant, intelligent, and safe. The fierce, terrifying fire that had burned in Valerie's chest the day she walked into courtroom 302 had settled into a quiet, permanent embers of vigilance. Maya closed her textbook and looked at her mother. "Did you see the news? About the Chicago Police Union?" Valerie's expression remained perfectly pleasant, betraying nothing of the classified maneuvering she had orchestrated from her office in Langley. "I caught a glimpse of it on the monitors at work. It's a shame how deep corruption can run. But the system has a way of correcting itself eventually." Maya smiled, leaning her head on Valerie's shoulder. She knew better than to ask questions. She knew that the system hadn't corrected anything. The system had been dragged, kicking and screaming, into the light by a mother who refused to let her child be a casualty of a broken world. "I love you, Mom," Maya whispered. Valerie wrapped her arm around her daughter, pulling her close as the golden afternoon light filled the room. I love you too, Maya. More than anything, the gavel of justice is often slow, blind, and skewed against the vulnerable. But occasionally, the universe balances the scales with a devastating precision. Bradley Collins learned too late that absolute power is an illusion, shattered the moment you threaten the wrong person. For Maya and Valerie, it was the end of a nightmare. For the corrupt, it was a terrifying reminder there is always a bigger predator.